Arab executive kicks out pregnant African wife. 20 years later, she visits him, but he thought he had left his past behind, forgotten the woman he once loved and the unborn child she carried. In his world of wealth and power, emotions had no place, and pride ruled every decision. But when she walked into his luxurious office 2 decades later, her presence shattered the fortress he'd built around his heart. She wasn't alone, and what she brought with her would change his life forever. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Get ready for a story of betrayal, regret, and the most unexpected reunion you'll ever witness. 20 years earlier, the halls of Khalil al-Fahim's mansion echoed with power and silence. Marble floors stretched endlessly, chandeliers sparkled like captured stars, and not a single detail was out of place. Except for one thing: her. Amina stood barefoot at the entrance of the grand hall, her hands trembling over the slight curve of her belly. She was barely 3 months pregnant, her rich dark skin glowing against the pale walls, her eyes filled with silent pleas. But Khalil stood across from her, his expression stone cold, dressed impeccably in his white thobe, his keffiyeh perfectly arranged. "It's over, Amina." His voice rang through the vast space, each word sharp and final. "You should leave before I have the guards escort you out." Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You promised me, Khalil. You promised we'd raise this child together." His jaw tightened. "That was before my family reminded me of who I am and what is expected of me. You're not part of that world." She stepped closer, her voice breaking. "I loved you, Khalil. I still—" "Enough," he snapped, turning his back on her. "Take whatever dignity you have left and leave." That was the last time Khalil saw her, or so he thought. 20 years passed like a storm he tried to forget. His business empire grew beyond even his wildest dreams, sprawling investments, lavish properties from Dubai to New York, and a lifestyle envied by kings. But despite all the luxury, something haunted him in the quiet hours of the night. No matter how many boardrooms he conquered, or how many zeros filled his accounts, there was a question that always lingered at the edges of his mind. What became of her? And then she appeared. It was an ordinary Tuesday. Khalil sat behind his massive mahogany desk in his penthouse office overlooking the Dubai skyline. The air was crisp with the scent of imported oud, the hum of business meetings flowing through the intercom. But when his assistant entered, her usual composed face looked uncertain. "Sir, there's someone here to see you," she said quietly. "I have no appointments." She insisted, and she said you'd understand when you saw her. He frowned, waving his hand impatiently. "Fine. Send her in." The door opened. and time collapsed. Amina stood there, unchanged yet transformed by the years. Her beauty was timeless, her posture dignified despite the modest, worn clothes she wore. But what stole Khalil's breath was not her presence alone. It was the tall young man who stood beside her. He looked no more than 20. His skin carried Amina's radiant complexion, but his sharp features, the intense stare, the proud lift of his chin, they were unmistakably Khalil's. Khalil stood up slowly, his heart thundering in his chest. His lips parted, but no words came out. Amina's voice was calm, but filled with quiet strength. "It's been a long time, Khalil." She paused, her eyes locked on his, unflinching. "And I thought it was time you met your son." For the first time in decades, Khalil al-Fahim, a man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, felt completely powerless. His knees almost gave out beneath him as he stared at the young man standing before him. The boy, no, the man, stood tall and proud. His shoulders squared, just like Khalil's, had been at his age. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, held the same storm Khalil often saw in his own reflection. And yet, beneath that cold composure, there was something more, something wounded. "What's your name?" Khalil asked, his voice low, almost cautious. The young man held his gaze, unwavering. "My name is Amir. My mother gave me your name as my middle name, Amir Khalil." The words struck like a hammer against Khalil's chest. All these years, and his legacy, his real legacy, had been walking the earth, completely unknown to him. Amina spoke before the silence grew too heavy. "He didn't come here for your money, Khalil. We never wanted that, but I couldn't look him in the eye anymore and pretend you didn't exist. He deserved to know who his father was." Khalil's fingers gripped the edge of his desk. "And what does he want now?" he asked, his voice cracking despite his best efforts to remain composed. Amir took a small step forward, his chin lifting with defiance. "Nothing," he said plainly. "I didn't come here looking for a father. I came to see the man who thought I wasn't worth staying for." The accusation hit Khalil harder than any financial loss he'd ever experienced. His empire meant nothing at that moment. Amina placed a gentle hand on Amir's arm, trying to ease the tension, but Amir pulled away, his eyes locked on Khalil. "I grew up watching my mother work herself to the bone to give me a life you never cared to be part of. While you sat in your towers and counted your fortune, she counted coins to buy me food. And you know what, Khalil?" He shook his head with a bitter smile. "She did just fine. We did just fine without you." Khalil swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Amir," he started, but the young man raised his hand to stop him. "I'm not here for apologies. You can't undo 20 years with a few regretful words. I just needed to look you in the eye and understand for myself how a man could walk away from this." He motioned toward himself, his voice breaking despite his efforts to stay strong. Khalil felt something crack open inside him, a feeling he'd buried for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like. Regret. Real, suffocating regret. "You're right," Khalil admitted, his voice low and raw. "There's nothing I can say to change the past. But if there's anything left of me worth knowing, I'm standing here, willing to try." Amir's eyes softened for just a second before hardening again. "That's not up to you," he said, turning to his mother. "It's up to me." Without another word, Amir turned and walked out, his broad shoulders disappearing through the glass doors. Khalil stood motionless, his chest heaving like he'd just fought the hardest battle of his life. Amina lingered, her eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. "Now you know, Khalil. You've seen the man he became without you. Strong, proud, and everything you could have been a part of. If only you'd stayed." With that, she turned and followed her son, leaving Khalil alone in his silent, empty empire. And for the first time in his life, he realized he had everything, except the one thing that truly mattered. The office felt unbearably empty after they left. Khalil stood frozen by the window, staring out over the glittering skyline of Dubai, a city he had helped shape with his business empire. And yet, at that moment, all the towering buildings, the sprawling wealth, the admiration of powerful men, it all seemed hollow. His hands trembled slightly as he poured himself a glass of water. He didn't touch alcohol, but he needed something to ground him, anything to keep from collapsing under the weight of what had just happened. His son, had stood before him, full of fire and pain, and walked away like a stranger. The echoes of Amir's words rang in his ears. "She did just fine. We did just fine without you." And it was true. Despite every hardship he'd imagined they faced, they didn't crumble. Amina had raised a man of strength and character, a man who didn't bend under the pressure of a powerful father standing before him. Khalil's pride should have admired that, but all he could feel was the sharp sting of regret. The next day, he couldn't focus. Meetings blurred together, numbers meant nothing. His thoughts wandered back to that young man's face, the reflection of his own features staring back with defiance. He needed to see them again. Against his usual calculated nature, Khalil instructed his driver to take him to the address his assistant had managed to discreetly find. It was a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, far from the polished glass towers of his world. When he arrived, he hesitated at the door. For a man who had faced kings and CEOs, this was the hardest confrontation of his life. His hand hovered over the doorbell, his chest tight with uncertainty. Before he could press it, the door opened. Amina stood there, wearing a simple dress, her hair tied back, her face calm but tired. She didn't look surprised to see him. "I thought you might come," she said softly. Khalil swallowed hard, his voice rough. "May I speak with him?" She studied him for a long moment before stepping aside. He's out back. He spends his evenings working on his old motorcycle. Says it helps him think. Khalil nodded and made his way around the building. There, in the fading golden light of the evening, Amir was crouched beside a rusted old motorcycle, his hands stained with oil, sleeves pushed up his strong arms. He looked at peace there, focused, determined, lost in the simple mechanics of something real and tangible. Khalil stood a few feet away, unsure how to begin. Amir spoke first without turning. "I figured you'd find me. I don't want to force my way into your life," Khalil said quietly. "But I had to see you again. Had to try." Amir stood slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. His face was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something Khalil hadn't seen before. Curiosity, maybe even a faint hint of longing. "You think one visit can make up for 20 years?" Amir asked, his voice low. "No," Khalil admitted. "I'm not that foolish. But maybe it can be a start." Amir crossed his arms over his chest, studying the man who shared his blood, but nothing else. "Why now?" "Because I was a coward then. I let pride and family expectations destroy the only thing that ever really mattered. And now I'm an old man, trying to make peace with the worst mistake of my life." For a long, painful moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them wasn't measured in feet, but in years of absence. Finally, Amir broke the silence. "You don't get to be my father, Khalil. You gave up that right. But," he sighed, glancing away before looking back, "I'm willing to see if you're capable of being something else. A part of my life, maybe, on my terms." A weight lifted from Khalil's chest, his eyes burning with emotion. "On your terms," he agreed. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning, and sometimes a beginning is all a man really needs. Days turned into weeks, and though their conversations were brief at first, a quiet understanding began to grow between them. Khalil didn't try to buy Amir's affection. He understood that trust couldn't be purchased with lavish gifts or empty words. Instead, he showed up, consistently, silently. Every evening after his meetings, Khalil found himself driving out of the city's towering skyline into the quieter outskirts, where life was simpler. He'd sit on the old wooden crate near the garage as Amir worked on his motorcycle, offering the occasional bottle of water or quietly handing over a wrench when needed. At first, their conversations stuck to safe topics: engines, tools, the unbearable summer heat. But slowly, cracks formed in the wall Amir had built. One humid evening, as thunder rumbled low in the distance and the sky painted itself in bruised shades of purple and gray, Amir set down his tools and leaned back against the wall, his hands smudged with grease. "Did you ever wonder about me?" he asked suddenly, his voice low, eyes fixed on the horizon. Khalil's chest tightened. He swallowed, knowing that whatever he said next had to be nothing but the truth. Every day, he admitted, his voice rough. In the quiet moments, when the world stopped moving so fast, I'd see your face in my mind, even though I didn't know what you looked like. I wondered if you had my stubbornness, if you walked like me, if you ever missed something, even if you didn't know what it was. Amir's lips twitched with the ghost of a smile. Yeah, I missed something. I used to think it was just the way life was, that something was always supposed to feel incomplete. He glanced at Khalil then, really looking at him in a way he hadn't before. And for the first time, Khalil didn't see anger in his son's eyes, only a deep, lingering sadness. I hated you for a long time, Amir confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Every time I saw a father toss a ball to his kid or show up at a school event, I hated you for not being there. Khalil felt the sting of those words deep in his bones, but he didn't shy away from them. He'd earned that pain. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said quietly, but I'm here now, and I'll keep showing up until the day you tell me to leave for good. Amir pushed away from the wall and picked up his rag, his jaw tightening as if he were wrestling with something inside himself. Then, after a long pause, he spoke again. My mom used to say something about you, he began, his voice almost lost beneath the growing wind. She said you were a man trapped by his own walls, that one day you'd realize the empire you built couldn't keep you warm at night. Khalil closed his eyes for a brief moment, her words cutting through him like a blade. She was right, he whispered. Silence settled between them again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It felt lighter, like something unresolved had been said aloud and didn't need to be fought anymore. As the first raindrops began to fall, Amir turned toward the garage. But before stepping inside, he paused and looked back at Khalil. See you tomorrow? He asked, his tone casual but laced with something deeper. Khalil felt a warmth spread through his chest he hadn't felt in years. I'll be here, he promised. And as the storm rolled in, washing away the dust of the past, Khalil realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't just waiting for redemption, he was finally working for it. The days following that storm felt different, lighter somehow, as if the air itself had shifted. For the first time, Khalil felt the weight of his past slowly lifting, replaced by moments that felt real, moments that mattered. He spent every free hour near Amir, careful not to push too hard, letting things unfold at their own pace. They shared quiet dinners, often sitting outside on the small balcony of Amina's apartment. Sometimes they talked about life, about the things Amir had done without a father, the challenges Amina had faced alone. Other times, they simply sat in silence, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, lost in their own thoughts. It was during one of those evenings that Amir finally broke the silence with a question that hung heavily in the air. Why didn't you fight for her? He asked, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. his voice raw but calm. Khalil leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He had dreaded this question for years, knowing it would come eventually. Because I was a coward, he admitted quietly. I let my family dictate my life. I cared more about appearances, about the expectations placed on me, than about the promises I made to your mother. He turned his gaze toward Amir. I loved her, Amir. I did, but I wasn't strong enough to stand against the pressure back then. And by the time I realized what I'd lost, it was too late. Amir clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists. She waited for you, you know, for a long time. Even when we had nothing, she never spoke a word against you. She just kept believing you'd come back. Khalil felt that familiar sting behind his eyes, a reminder of every moment wasted, every chance he'd thrown away. I don't deserve her forgiveness, he said softly, and I'm not asking for it. But I'm here now, trying to be the kind of man she believed I could be. Amir stood, pacing the small balcony, his emotions clearly at war inside him. You think you can just show up after 20 years and undo all that pain? He asked, his voice cracking despite his effort to sound strong. No, Khalil answered honestly, but I can show up for the next 20, if you'll let me. The wind picked up again, rustling the curtains behind them. Amir stopped pacing, his back to Khalil, staring out into the night. She still loves you, you know, Amir said quietly. Khalil's heart clenched painfully. She shouldn't, he whispered more to himself than to Amir. And yet, she does, Amir said, turning to face him. Even after everything. The door behind them creaked, and Amina stepped out onto the balcony, her presence soft but commanding. Her eyes met Khalil's, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. The past can't be erased, Khalil, but maybe. It doesn't have to define the future. Her words felt like a second chance, one Khalil never thought he'd be offered. Amir stepped back, giving them space. Without saying another word, he disappeared inside, leaving his mother and father standing together under the quiet night sky. Khalil took a tentative step closer to her. I don't know how to start making things right, he confessed. Amina smiled softly, a sad but hopeful curve of her lips. You just did. And for the first time in his life, Khalil realized that love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about showing up, about standing still when every instinct told you to run. It was about being present, even when you feared you didn't deserve to be. The final test of a man's worth is not how he begins his life, but how he chooses to end his story. And for Khalil al-Fahim, that final chapter had just begun. Weeks turned into months. Little by little, the heavy walls that time and absence had built between them started to crumble. Khalil no longer arrived at Amina's modest home in his luxury cars or designer suits. He came humbly, dressed simply, sleeves rolled up, ready to help where he could, fixing the broken railing on her balcony, repairing leaky faucets, or just sitting quietly with her as the sun dipped low over the city. Amir, once distant and guarded, began to open up in small, precious moments. One evening, as they worked side by side replacing the rusted chain on the old motorcycle, Amir broke the comfortable silence. "You know, for a guy who owns half the city, you're not bad with your hands," he joked, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. Khalil chuckled softly, his eyes glimmering with something that had been absent from his life for far too long. Peace. "Turns out, I missed my true calling," he replied. "Maybe I should have been a mechanic instead of chasing boardrooms and bank accounts." Amir glanced at him, his smile lingering. "Yeah, maybe you would have been happier." The words hung there between them, and for the first time neither of them rushed to fill the silence. It simply was, a quiet acceptance of what had been lost and what might still be salvaged. But the most unexpected moment came on a cool evening near the end of autumn. Khalil had invited Amina and Amir to a small private gathering at one of his country estates, a place far removed from the cold, sharp edges of his corporate world. The estate wasn't a display of wealth that night. There were no guests in silk gowns or men in tailored suits, just simple lights strung between olive trees, the soft scent of jasmine in the air, and the gentle sound of oud music drifting through the breeze. Amina stood beneath the stars, her eyes closed as she inhaled the fragrant air. Khalil approached her slowly, his heart pounding like a young man's, his hands slightly trembling. When she opened her eyes, he stood before her, holding something small in his palm. It wasn't a grand diamond ring or some flashy symbol of wealth. It was the old, worn silver bracelet she used to wear, one he had given her when they first fell in love, before everything went wrong. "I found it," Khalil said softly. "I kept it all these years, tucked away in a drawer I couldn't bear to open. I didn't think I deserved to return it to you. But maybe it's time." Amina's eyes glistened as she reached for the bracelet, her fingers brushing against his. "I never forgot, Khalil," she whispered, "no matter how hard I tried." With trembling hands, he fastened the bracelet around her wrist, his touch lingering a second longer than necessary. Just then, Amir appeared at the edge of the courtyard, watching them with a quiet smile. And for the first time, Khalil saw not just acceptance in his son's eyes, but a hint of pride. Later that evening, as the stars stretched endlessly overhead and the gentle notes of the oud played into the night, Khalil finally allowed himself to believe in second chances. He took Amina's hand, his fingers weaving through hers as they sat beneath the olive trees. "No more empty promises," he said, his voice low and resolute. "From this day forward, whatever time we have left, I'll spend it proving that I was always meant to stand by your side." Amina leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice barely a whisper. "And this time, I believe you." For the first time in 20 years, Khalil felt whole. Not because he had reclaimed the wealth he'd almost lost, but because he had found something far more valuable: his family, his redemption, and a love that had withstood the harshest storms. And as the night carried on, with soft laughter and quiet conversation beneath the stars, Khalil knew. Some stories don't end with regret. They begin again, right where they left off.